Okay, here's our video on living environment, the living environment regions, which used to be called biology. So really the focus is biology. And for the first series with video we're doing is what is science? So what is science to you? I'm sure we all know what science is since elementary school. You've been in labs. So one key in science is, well, we're in labs. And if we're in labs, what do you think we're doing? So the key word in science is we need to do experiments. Let's write it down there. Experiments is the key. So we're going to go over some of those criterias that from experiments to theory, and we'll talk about that in science. Okay. Now for the ancient Greeks, and I'll write down ancient Greeks here. If we use our pen, we should use a pen, right? Get that pen going. Well, stick with green. Why not? So Aristotle. Here's one person from ancient Greek. And Aristotle relied a lot on logic for his science, but he also used observation. Now, for Aristotle, there was a belief that the Earth was the center of the solar system. That is the geocentric theory. And of course, we don't believe that today. We believe in the helio, meaning sun centric. And Galileo and Copernicus, they came up with that heliocentric view. But Aristotle looked at the sun. It seemed like the sun was going around the Earth. So that was an observation. So the Greeks relied a lot on logic and observation in their science. We rely more on experimentation. We have to prove that the experiment works. So let's look at the scientific method. Now, one of the first persons to come up with this was Francis Bacon. What a cool last name, Bacon. Who doesn't like bacon? So Francis Bacon, around circa 1600s, about that, he came up with the scientific method. So let's look at the scientific method. What is the first thing we should look at in science for us to have some kind of, to lead to an experiment? Well, first, there has to be observation. You have to observe something, and it doesn't have to be sight. It's our senses, right? Whether you're seeing something, you're feeling something, you're hearing something, you're tasting something. So, for example, let's say that you were outside and you smelled a barbecue. Let's get a barbecue picture. All right, here's a nice one. So, let's say you're walking down the street. You don't see the barbecue, but as you're walking down the street, you smell fire. So, you're using sense. You're observing the sense of smell, right? You're smelling the fire and you also smell meat. So, that is your observation. And you can infer, there's a word, infer. Let's get the pen back. So, use red. Red. So, you're observing, you have observation. In this case, you were smelling, right? And then you inferred. To infer means to come to some conclusion on what you're observing. So you're inferring that someone is barbecuing. That's your. And of course, if you keep going and maybe it's your next door neighbor and you knock on his door and you ask if you can come in, which is kind of rude. But you see that he is indeed barbecuing. So right there, your observation was true. So one of the first steps in scientific method is to observe and then to infer some conclusion on what you're observing. Let's break it down in a chart. All right, so here's our chart. So we had an observation. We smelled a barbecue, and we were inferring that someone in our neighborhood was actually cooking. And of course, if you know, investigated, you would have found out that indeed is true. But for science, though, we need to lead to an experiment because we want to find out questions in nature, how things work and why things work. So the first thing, after you observe and you do some research, you want to ask yourself a question. So bring the pen back up. Well, there's our arrow. Use yellow, why not? So let's think of a question here. Let's just think of something very simple. Let's say that you noticed in an observation that the grass grew faster. The grass grew faster when it rained. And this is very basic, but we can get a good example out of this. So you observed that the grass grew faster when it rained. So maybe your question is, will the grass grow at all if it doesn't rain? So that's a question. And that, once you have your question, you want to then form an hypothesis. What is your guess? What's your guess? Maybe you'll say, well, logically, and here again, using the ancient Greeks, there is a little bit of logic in science because you want to form an hypothesis based on logic. You could say, well, perhaps the grass will not grow faster if it doesn't rain. So then you have to set up an experiment. And we'll go over some of the variables that you need in an experiment, but let's just do this basically right now. So you make a plan to test your hypothesis. Let's say then let's get a picture going here. So here we have 3 plants. Now, it's very important, and we'll go over this later, is that when you're doing experiments, you have to make sure that all the variables are the same. Now, right here, you have different plants. So right away, you should know that this experiment really wouldn't be valid, right? Because some plants, like these succulents over here, let's get our pen going, right? This succulent over here and this one over here, they can go more days without water than this plant. So let's just say, for example, we're doing something very simple. All we were doing was this plant, and we didn't water it for, let's say, 5 days. Right, we'll forget about that plant. We'll forget about that plant for now. Now, after 5 days, you notice that the plant was dying. You may make a conclusion that this plant without water will not grow. That could be your hypothesis. And then when you did the experimentation, you found out that was indeed true. And keep in mind, this is very, very important. There could be so many different variables involved in why the plant did not survive. So you can't just conclude, you can't just say, well, it's just because of the water, right? So remember, when you ask a question, your question was, after you observed outside, you observed that the plants grew faster with water, you asked the question, well, can a plant grow without water? And it has to be a specific plant, because we know different plants will last longer without water. So your hypothesis is an educated guess. You're guessing that the plants will not. And in this case, this plant, right? And of course, when you made your experiment, your hypothesis was right, but there are many variables involved. So number 4 is you record your experiment's results, you analyze it, and draw conclusions. Now, if you listed all the variables, like the sunlight and the soil and so forth, maybe you can come to a better conclusion. Let's go on for another example. So let's look at this experiment. So in the previous experiment that we did with that one plant, it wasn't really correct because, first of all, there was no control. There was only one plant and there was so many variables involved. So when you do an experiment, you just want one variable, one independent variable. So let's look at these 2 plants. Let's go back to this observation, right? You observe that plants grow with sun and water. You know that's your observation. You've seen that happen, and you're inferring that plants need water and sun to grow. That's what you're inferring. And then you come with a hypothesis and you're saying, well, what if I give fertilizer, if I give nutrients to the soil, will the plant grow larger, taller? So that is your independent variable. If now the hypothesis again is the fertilizer, you're asking the question, will the plant grow taller if I use fertilizer? And that fertilizer is the independent variable. It's going to be only used in one of the plants. So the control, this word control, that is the plant that's not going to be part of the independent variable. It's not using the fertilizer. So when you're doing an experiment, both these plants have to have identical pots, identical soil, they have to have identical sunlight, and they have to be watered with the same amount of water at the same time in order for this experiment to be correct. So again, the control is not getting the fertilizer. So you only have one independent variable. In this case, right here, the control does not have the fertilizer, but the experiment does. Now, the dependent variable is the result, and you can see, according to this picture, that the fertilizer did indeed work. Now, that'll be trial 1. Now, when you're in lab in high school and in middle school, you remember that you always did at least 3 trials. The more trials, the better. So again, control, independent variable, dependent variable, very important. All right, here's another example. So again, with observation, you notice that light does affect the plant. But then you come to another hypothesis. So here's the hypothesis right up here. This is the question you're asking. As we lost it, go back there. Here we are. So let's get the pen. We'll use that color. So this is your hypothesis. There we go. And you're saying, does red light affect plant growth? And for some reason, this is what you came up with. So the independent variable, again, it's only going to be used on one of the plants, is the color. You're going to use red. The other color will be, let's say you had 3 other plants that use yellow light. And this one other plant is only going to use red. So the independent variable there's only one independent variable, and it's the light color, the red. You want to see if it works. The dependent variable, of course, is the outcome, the plant height. If indeed, let's say that they're the same height, then it didn't work. And the control is what has to be the same, right? Everything has to be the same. They have to have the same water, the same soil, the same temperature. They have to be watered at the same time. They have to have access to the sun at the same time, and so forth. So again, if you use different pots or different soil, you have to throw out this experiment. So after you've done this, you come to a conclusion. And if indeed these red light does make the plants grow, that doesn't mean that it's conclusive. You have to do another trial. You have to do another trial after that. The more trials, the better. And of course, you want to mark down everything you've done because you want another scientist to reenact your experiment. And if more scientists reenact your experiment over and over and over again, there can be a big probability, a big conclusion that red light does indeed work. Now, I'm not saying red light does work. This is just an example. So when we're dealing with science, we always come across law and theory. So let's break it down what it is, the difference. Very important to know with theory, though. It's not what you think. Some people misuse theory. A theory is the highest you can go. It's the highest you can get in science. It's not where people say, oh, that's only a theory. If someone's told you it's only a theory in science, you should say thank you, because a theory is the highest it can be. So let's explain this again. A law will state how something happens. It's the word how. How does it happen? In other words, it's a fact from an observation. It's not really a how. Let's get rid of that how. So, for example, if I threw an apple in the air, so here's an apple. Red apple, and old red delicious. If I threw this apple, and we change the color here. If I threw the apple in the air, we'll observe that it will fall back down. So we know there's a law of gravity. No one's going to argue that law of gravity on Earth. It's a law. It's a fact from an observation. But a theory will explain how it happens. So how is not the law, how is the theory, how or why it happens. Explaining why it happens is a theory. And if you can explain why it happened, and more people can use your experiment over and over again, then it will become a theory in the scientific community. Let's use an example here. So with a law, if it's a law, you can make a prediction based on an observation, like the law of gravity. Like I said before, if I threw an apple in the air, this time we have a Granny Smith. Why not make it a little bigger? If I threw that apple in the air, we know at some point it's going to come down. Maybe it'll splash. Who knows? So that's a prediction. You're making a prediction. You know with the law of gravity, if you throw it in the air, it's going to fall down. So that'll be our law. But theory is going to explain why. Why is it doing it? That's the theory. And when we're talking about theory, we can talk about Einstein's theory or Newton's theory. According to Einstein, put Einstein up there. According to Einstein, gravity is the warping of space due to mass. And of course, there's more involved in this. And I'll explain that in other videos. But right now, just so you know, law is a prediction based on an observation, and a theory is trying to explain why. So Newton tried to explain that, and Einstein explained that. So right now we accept Einstein's theory, and graduate students all over the world will try to prove it's wrong or to try to prove it's right. So far, he hasn't been proven wrong. So another thing to know about theories is they are not 100% fact. They're just proven acceptable until proven wrong. So they can change with more evidence. Very important to know that with theories. The theory can change when more evidence comes up. Very important. Now, it'd be kind of weird if our law changed. If you threw an apple in the air and it didn't fall down, there has to be an explanation why, right? So just hold up any object right now, when it doesn't fall, if it's not lighter than air, then there's something wrong with our laws. But usually you don't see that. In fact, you won't see that happening. Okay, and just to sum it up, again, you're observing something, you're going to infer, you're going to ask a question, and that question is an educated guess. You're going to form an educated guess. That's your hypothesis. You run an experiment with many trials if you can. You record the data. You analyze the data, very important. And if you find that your hypothesis was wrong, well, then go back, form another hypothesis, and do the trials over again. And of course, though, even if your hypothesis failed, you do want to report it. You want other scientists and other students to be able to, form your hypothesis, to perform the experiment that you did, and maybe you'll come up with something new. You never know. All right, that's the first video in a living environment, and we'll move on from there.